They're using the military, they're using societal power, ideology and religion. So it starts in Libya, goes to Yemen, and then goes to Sudan. Same model being played also in Somalia. Emiratis were flying dozens and dozens of plane loads of arms into eastern Libya. The removal of that Morsi government. The UAE realized that the mosque was a threat, demobilizing the power of Islam.
Many affluent Muslims in the West will go to Dubai and feel very comfortable in their Islamic skin.
Mostly Sufi sort of strand of Islam was saying, you know,
it's apolitical.
Apolitical.
The UAE has really been firmly on the side of Israel.
And they just hunt them down and kill them.
The United Arab Emirates has curated a string of anti-revolutionary non-state actors across the Middle East to serve the state's deeply secular interests. Abu Dhabi has waged a war against Islamic civil society under the pretext of fighting terrorism, and today acts as the primary means by which the small but effective Federation of Emirates prevents the rise of independent states in the Middle East. Behind every foiled attempt to wrestle power from Arab dictators is the UAE, which has used its petrodollars and economic prowess to curtail civil society activism. Its deep alliance with Israel and its Zionist project has given the UAE an unprecedented means to act as a spoiler in the region. Today we explore the tentacles of this project and its impact upon the hopes of much of ordinary Arab Muslim society. Now, our guest today is Dr. Andreas Krieg, an associate professor at the Defence Studies Department of King's College London and a strategic risk consultant. He recently penned a piece which forms the backdrop of our conversation on the assertive statecraft of the UAE. Now, please remember to press the subscribe button so that you will always be alerted to a new show. Additionally, you can donate to our preferred charity partner, Baitulmaal, which strives for excellence in the charity sector, by clicking on the link in the description. Baitulmaal does amazing work to bring much needed aid to our ummah in need. Dr. Andreas Krieg, welcome to The Thinking Muslim.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's lovely to have you with us. Now, I think this topic is a fascinating one, and you wrote an article recently for the Middle East Eye, which we'll put in the show notes, where you talked about just these sort of broad tentacles of the UAE, of Abu Dhabi, and how it acts maybe as a malign way in the Middle East. So I want to explore that today. Now, in your article, you talk about a lot of specific case studies, Sudan and Libya and Somalia and other countries. But I just want to get a general understanding before we drill down into the specifics. So you say in your article, Abu Dhabi has curated a multi-layered network of violent non-state actors, financiers, traders, political figureheads, and influencers to create bridgeheads in countries of strategic value to Emirati national interests. Explain that to me. Explain what you claim the UAE is doing in the Middle East and beyond.
Well, if we zoom out, I mean, first we need to understand the UAE is a small state by all conventional metrics. They're a country of 10 million, of which only 1 million are actually citizens, so 90% actually foreigners.
Yeah.
Around 500 billion in terms of their GDP. But in terms of size, the way we would look at the UAE as a country, it's a small state. But since 2011, since the Arab Spring, they've really emerged as a major player in this part of the world. Yeah. But they've always been somewhat plagued by an inherent capacity shortage, right? If you only have 1 million people, citizens, there were limits, traditionally been limits on what you can do in terms of statecraft. And so what they have been doing since the late 2000s and then very much kind of increased this since the Arab Spring is really curating, orchestrating networks of private individuals, outsourcing statecraft, if you will, right, to mercenaries, to violent non-state actors. Some of them they created. The most important ones they've actually created. They've given them the backing, the financial support that they required. But they also draw extensively on the market, like they'll use private corporations, they use multinationals or individual traders to get into countries and get into locations where they think they have an interest. And that's a very new way of looking at statecraft. It's very different from how we do it in the West, very different from how we do it today in the UK. But I'd say, you know, historically, this is how Britain built the empire. It was done through the use of the market. And the UAE, I think, have learned from that. And they've done it very, very well, because not only by delegation do you achieve a level of plausible deniability, because you can always say, I have nothing to do with these people. These are just private individuals. These are just private companies. Some of them are based here. And even if they're invested or involved in sort of malign or illegal activity, which, you know, as we're talking about smuggling of commodities, we're looking at money laundering, a lot of it's funneling and also channeling streams of corruption in and out of different countries. So if, you know, looking at that, it looks like the UAE are doing something quite malign, but they can say we have nothing to do with it because these are all private individuals, private companies. They do whatever they want to do. We just offer the jurisdiction to them. But it's obviously more sinister than that because the UAE is not just offering their jurisdiction for these people to coincidentally operate out of the UAE. Every single company and individual that is involved in this sort of network-centric statecraft has been lured into the UAE by the leadership. So it's not coincidental and it is strategic. And I think that makes the UAE very different from their neighbors in the Gulf, where, you know, they're usually quite passive. The Emiratis are, especially Abu Dhabi, very assertive, very strategic, very measured in terms of how they align the means they have available to themselves with the ends that they want to achieve.
That's as you mentioned there, 2011 as a pivotal moment in this sort of re-emergence of or emergence of UAE statecraft. Why 2011? What is it about this moment that makes this relatively small state, turns this small state into a fairly robust regional actor?
So a lot of things happened, but the key sort of moment was the fall of the regime in Egypt and so the beginning of the Arab Spring, which obviously took place in late 2010 in Tunisia. But, you know, that kind of set in motion a massive development across the region. And the problem was not just that the old sort of powerhouses, authoritarian dictatorships collapsed, but that the old sort of guarantor of stability, the United States, weren't really doing anything about it. I mean, they were sitting on the fence, Obama at the time, president, sitting on the fence of should we or should we not support Mubarak? And then they dropped Mubarak and then they endorsed the then freely elected Muslim Brotherhood president. And that for the Emiratis was an absolute pivotal moment because they said, we're on our own. Nobody's really thinking strategically about security, stability in the region. We are on our own and we have to take over responsibility. And so they did in 2011. In Libya, they got involved together with the Qataris. I mean, that was, you know, one moment where Qatar and the UAE actually during the Arab Spring were sort of cooperating, even though on different sides, but they were cooperating against the Gaddafi regime trying to bring stability in Libya. But the idea that they're a small state and they really need to curate and create power with whatever means available to themselves, that was a wake-up call where the Emiratis said, we are on our own and we have to take over responsibility. And so they did.
So when we think about the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed comes to mind. Just, you know, give us a lay of the land. Who are the key figures here? I mean, in your article, you talk about Bani Fatima. Explain this sort of leadership hierarchy of the UAE.
So the UAE, like all the neighboring countries, they are a tribally based monarchy, right? So they're a monarchy, but they're also a federation of 7 different emirates, each of which have their own royal family or have their own emir and leader. And then Abu Dhabi is the capital, but traditionally, at least when the Emirates were founded in 1971, there was supposed to be a bit of power sharing going on. It wasn't all sort of concentrated in the hands of the Al Nahyan, which is the royal family of Abu Dhabi. But what we've seen over the last couple of decades is this concentration of power in the hand of the Al Nahyan. And beyond that, we've seen Mohammed bin Zayed and the bin Zayed children, the children of Zayed, specifically the sons of that wife of Zayed, Fatima, hence why they call them Bani Fatima. These sons have really reshaped Abu Dhabi and thereby afterwards also Emirati statecraft to their liking. And so what we see is a massive concentration of force and concentration of effort in the hands of these 3 brothers in particular. So Mohammed bin Zayed, he's the president. Mansour bin Zayed is sort of the financial, you know, statecraft, economic statecraft sort of wizard. You know, he's leading, you know, he's using the massively deep pockets of the UAE, of Abu Dhabi, to kind of drive statecraft overseas. And the last one is Tahnun bin Zayed, who is more or less, has been for a long time in the shadows, but he's the national security advisor. And he has been curating all kinds of networks, also, again, using private companies, but not necessarily for economic return, but for strategic return. So he's using these sort of relationships to extract influence and also power for Abu Dhabi. And so these 3 have really risen into this position of power very much since the late 2000s, but accelerated since the Arab Spring, with Mohammed bin Zayed really in the shadows of his brother, who for a long time ruled the country and then died, but in the shadow really curated this massive apparatus of statecraft in Abu Dhabi, which today is dominating the UAE.
Assalamu alaikum. Today we're continuing Baitulmaal's efforts on the ground for the water supply project. Today we're targeting a new tent camp with hundreds and hundreds of displaced families that are suffering from the critical need of drinking water.
Thank you for the organization of Baitulmaal. Thank you.
شكرا لمؤسسة بيت المال، نشكرهم جزيل الشكر وبارك الله فيهم، وشكرا للعطاء اللي هم بيعملوه والجهود اللي بيعملوه.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. We would like to thank Baitulmaal institution. May Allah bless you.
شكرا يا مؤسسة بيت المال.
So can I ask you about philosophy? Like, what is it? What are the ideas that underpin this sort of turn to this new UAE statecraft? I mean, in your piece and a few pieces that you've written in your book, you talk about the anti-revolutionary forces that the UAE are supporting across the Middle East. Like, just paint a picture of what is it they're trying to do in that region.
Look, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about the childhood and youth of Mohammed bin Zayed. He was overseas. He lived in Morocco for a while.
Right.
And allegedly there he had some exposure to people who were close to a Muslim Brotherhood way of thinking, Islamist approach to statecraft and life. And, you know, I think he said that or people have, you know, he mentioned that to others, where he said, you know, for him, a pivotal moment in his life was 9/11, when he saw, first of all, what happened at the heart of American financial power in New York, and then also seeing Muslims involved in that in the name of Islam. And for him, that was kind of a shocking experience. And he said, okay, that is not the form of Islamism that I endorse. And so that kind of, I think, was one pivotal moment for him. But then over the years, obviously, the UAE, unlike, for example, Qatar or Oman, had an opposition group that was also aligned with the overall thinking of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Al-Islah movement. They weren't really a very much, you know, by most sort of, you know, by most standards, they wouldn't have been a threat to the regime per se. But they were advocating for a form of governments which was more inclusive, where there were checks and balances, and which wasn't as authoritarian and autocratic. And that in itself is a threat, and was perceived as a threat by the Al Nahyan, a threat to regime security. And so taking all of this together, the philosophy now is really run, the overall philosophy is driven by the culture of Mohammed bin Zayed. And that's a culture of defense, security-centric. I mean, he's a man who led the security sector. He's a man of the security sector. He went to Sandhurst here in the UK. So he's very much a military man.
Yeah.
What you end up with is a sort of strategic culture in Abu Dhabi that was really defined by this one, or is defined by this one man, Mohammed bin Zayed, a military man,
Yeah.
who looks at the world through the lens of threat rather than a lens of opportunity. And he's also someone who frames the world very much in a zero-sum fashion. I need to win, you need to lose. And even when they look at win-win situations at times, they're still, I would say, win-win situations where the Emiratis kind of retain more control than the other side. They want to be always slightly stronger than the other side that they're working with.
Yeah.
And so that is a sort of mindset that is very uncommon, I'd say, for the Gulf in general. I mean, tribal politics have always been about pragmatism. It's about sort of win-win situations. Obviously, has been a lot of fighting traditionally as well.
Yeah.
But you're trying, in the Gulf at least, you're trying to find common ground and then work from there. And being assertive against your neighbor in particular, something quite alien in the way that we've seen it at least played out by Abu Dhabi on various occasions against Qatar, against Oman, and so on.
I mean, historically, and maybe again, this is a sort of a simplistic characterization of the region, but historically, we, especially during the Cold War, we tend to think of these Arab states as quite client states, or at least states that are within the orbit of the West, and they tend to engage in regional and foreign policy after consultation with the West. Now, in a previous answer, you mentioned that as the West resolves and moves away from the Middle East, actors like the UAE have sort of stepped in. Like, is there a relationship between US policy, for example, European Union policy, objectives in the Middle East, and the activities of the UAE government?
Yeah, so the Emiratis were, so again, going back to them being a small state, they used to be traditionally a client state to the US or to the West. They saw themselves that, I like that. And then after 2011, they said, we're on our own, and we need to diversify our relationships. So
we can't claim they're autonomous in their...
They're becoming increasingly... They're trying to become more autonomous. Obviously, in terms of where they get their weapons from is still the US. And they still want US protection, but they're also saying we can't rely on it, hence we need to diversify our security relationship. But more than that, they've become extremely assertive as well. And one thing they've done very well, so one of the pivotal moments in the US-UAE relationship was an episode in 2006 when DP World, one of the biggest state-owned enterprises and biggest logistics firms, one of the biggest logistics firms in the world who operate ports, they wanted to get into American ports, operating American ports on the eastern seaboard. And at the time, the Bush administration was saying we're not having a Muslim state running our port facilities, and at the very peak and height of the war against terror. And so the UAE said, okay, we need to change our image. We're not like the other Muslim states. We are different. And so they have really, and that was, 2006, everyone was talking about counterterrorism and how terrorism was the greatest threat to national security. And they've really jumped onto that bandwagon of saying, we are going to be the leader on counterterrorism, and we're going to adopt the sort of narratives that we've seen in the UK and the United States, which kind of, the sort of prevent a strategy of saying, let's put all Muslims under, in doubt. Let's question what they do because they potentially are terrorists. And that is, here is a Muslim country endorsing that. There's a Muslim country investing into think tanks and what we call the CVE community, the Countering Violent Extremism community, since 2006, where they said, okay, we are a Muslim country, but we want to support these think tanks, these research centers, and these experts, quote unquote, on violent extremism, and thereby become a champion of counterterrorism. And so, the way that they've looked at the United States as well is through that lens of counterterrorism. They're like, we want to be a partner helping the US fighting terror. And obviously in the 2000s, that was very much on vogue. And then 2011, as we come to the Arab Spring, Obama administration, terrorism wasn't that much of a sort of driving force. But luckily for the Emiratis, Daesh happened, and ISIS started to occur in Syria and Iraq, 2013-14, and then suddenly it was on vogue again, and again the UAE was leading sort of that push of saying we are, and it's not just countering violent extremism, because it's really CVE or countering terrorism with a particular focus on Muslims. It's Islamic terrorism in particular, and so they've really owned that. That they own that narrative. And it has been extremely potent since.
In 2013, Mohammed Morsi was deposed from government, and you argue that the UAE was pretty pivotal in the moves against Morsi. I mean, how did the UAE go about removing Morsi after a year of governance?
I think we should go back to, again, 2011, right? We see a lot of Islamist groups as the best organized groups that kind of occurred in the quagmire and the chaos of collapsing regimes in Libya and in Tunisia and in Egypt and also in Syria. So Islamist groups are well organized. They start occurring not just as civil societal actors, but also as militant actors. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt obviously was the most potent and long-standing sort of opposition force in the Arab world. And they now suddenly were driving opposition, not just opposition, but also were elected into power in 2012. That for the Emiratis was an absolute shock moment. And obviously then Morsi was also endorsed by the West as a democratically elected leader. Obviously Morsi made loads of mistakes, right? I mean, this sort of deep-seated distrust vis-a-vis the Egyptian military, The fear of being persecuted led him to persecute others, saying, okay, I have to cement my power as much as I can because God knows what's going to happen next year. So he became increasingly authoritarian. Obviously, the Egyptian economy and social politics didn't move anywhere. You know, obviously, the Egyptian regime had collapsed. There have been chaos for over a year or 2 years. The economy is not doing well. And most Egyptians were anyway disenfranchised, alienated by any sort of leadership, not just with the Muslim Brotherhood, but they wanted things to move quickly, and things didn't move quickly. Not only because of the Muslim Brotherhood, but also because of Morsi's policies. So in 2013, early 2013, we see very small groups popping up. I think it was originally in Alexandria, of liberal groups, liberal opponents to the Muslim Brotherhood, liberal secular Egyptians who said, you know, we opposed the Morsi government as much as we opposed the Mubarak government. We want a liberal secular sort of revolution. They were a fringe group, a tiny fringe group, a few thousand. And they kind of developed into, you know, somewhat what they called the Tamarud movement, a civil societal movement opposing the Morsi government. And what the Emiratis had realized is that if you were using that organic movement and push it, provide it with material support, information support, you know, military support as well as the support of the Egyptian military, you could kind of orchestrate something that will grow from this very small fringe group into quite a big movement. So what the Emiratis were doing, they were ripening the opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood from kind of January 2013 until June 2013. Over 6 months, this Tamarut movement grew from this sort of small fringe group into something, a movement within Egypt that brought nearly 1 million people onto the streets. You had mass protests, and in the background. So what the Emiratis did, they obviously funded actors on the ground. They engaged with media companies and PR companies, but also with Egyptian media outlets to kind of push a narrative how bad the Muslim Brotherhood was. They, in the background, engaged with the Egyptian military and military intelligence, trying to kind of create this pretext that then the Egyptian military could seize in June 2013, as you know, when the coup happened. So it started as an organic movement, and then it became sort of a subverted movement for Emirati interests, and they were extremely pivotal in that. I think that was something where the Emiratis were very influential, and I think for them that was a moment where they realized, actually, and it wasn't just money, it's also the power of orchestration, bringing different actors together, let them all work together towards a common goal, which was the removal of that Morsi government. You can actually have an impact. You don't need the United States to shape and change regimes in the region. If you have potent partners that you can work through or work with, you empower them leading from behind, even a fairly small state like the UAE can have a massive impact. And I think the same sort of model was then reused a year later in 2014 in Libya with Haftar, saying, if we can do it in Egypt, maybe we can do it in Libya. And so this is kind of where this axis of secessionists started, this entire movement, a counter-revolution to the Arab Spring really unfolded.
So I just want to understand this counter-revolutionary movement. Is it that the UAEC observe these groups to be insufficiently secular, insufficiently connected to the sort of historical, I suppose, sort of trajectory of governments in the Middle East that tend to be dictators or tend to be undemocratic? Or is it that they have a very explicit goal of preventing any Islamist form of governance in the Middle East? Like, explain that philosophical idea to me of this.
I think it has, so obviously they look at it through the lens of being an authoritarian tribal monarchy, where, you know, where freedom of speech was never a thing, but where freedom of speech has entirely disappeared in the UAE over the last 15 years. And here is a civil societal movement, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or any other Islamist NGO, that is able to mobilize people in one direction or the other, potentially shaping the course of history, toppling regimes and replacing it with an Islamic democratic sort of government or form of government. I think so it's the focus on threat. And beyond that, I think it's grown from a fear of the Muslim Brotherhood to fear of civil society at large. And the key issue, you know, as you know, the sort of forum that exists even today in authoritarian countries in the Middle East is the masjid, is the mosque. The mosque is sort of the root cause of mobilization for people, right? All the protests during the Arab Spring started from a sermon, usually on Friday prayer, because that's where people come together. That's the kind of the only forum you have left outside the house where people can come together, talking mostly about religion, but also talking about societal issues and political issues. And so the UAE realized that the mosque was a threat. And so their entire policy, some people call it the Jeffersonian approach of kind of a divide between state and religion that they're advocating since 2011, is about full control of civil society, full control of society. And so Islam has always been a form of mobilizing people against tyranny.
Right.
And so it's a very powerful narrative, a very powerful mobilizing force, even without putting an ism on the Islam, right? So controlling the mosque was key for the Emiratis. And so they were the first ones in the Gulf where the sermons on Friday prayers were written by the Ministry of Al-Qaf, by a secular civil authority, basically completely demobilizing the power of Islam to kind of inspire and move people, controlling that. And so this is where this is coming from. This is where the fear of Islamism comes from, right? Islamism is very much a Western term, but this idea that Islam can be politicized, that was the greatest fear for them, because it's something that naturally occurs in a Muslim country. And if you don't control it, it can topple you. And that's kind of where, and that development that we've seen starting in 2011 has further radicalized to a point where they don't just export this ideology to other emirates in the UAE, but exported it to the Arab world through their various sort of clients like Sisi in Egypt or Haftar in Libya, and the STC in Yemen, and you name it. But they've exported it even to the West, where there's this very infamous, I think it was a 2015 or 2016 interview with Abdullah bin Zayed, the brother of Mohammed bin Zayed and foreign minister, who went on record and saying, we are much stronger on counterterrorism than Britain is. We're much stronger than the United States these days, because we have zero tolerance for any form of Islam and Islamism. And that is kind of bizarre. This is kind of a point that they're still taking. This is an approach they're still taking, where they're saying we are tougher on Islamism than the West.
There is a paradox here, because of course many affluent Muslims, say in the West, will go to Dubai, go to UAE and visit it, or even migrate there for a period of time and work and feel very comfortable in their Islamic skin in these places, because of the sort of Islamic sensitivities are somewhat safeguarded by the UAE state. But you seem to argue that on one level the UAE is actually working against Islamic civil society from flourishing in the Middle East, yet a lot of Muslims will find comfort in UAE society and their sort of practice and adherence of Islam. In fact, it's fair to say that the UAE also patronized, I suppose, a number of Islamic scholars who very regularly sing the praises of the UAE state. So explain that sort of contradiction there to me, please.
Right. I mean, Dubai is obviously not representative of the UAE, but Dubai has always over the last 30 years been certainly not a hub for Islamic scholarship or a hub of a sort of it is situated in a Muslim country, but it's extremely secular. People measure the progressiveness of the UAE in Dubai based on the sort of umbrella alcoholic drinks they can have on the beach and the bikinis they can wear and that sort of stuff. And I think hence the appeal is probably more towards non-Muslims in this part of the world. But also Muslims go there because they say, it socioeconomically makes sense. But the Emiratis have cultivated a sort of ideology about Islam. They've, first of all, mostly Sufi sort of strand of Islam, was saying,
it's apolitical.
Apolitical. The idea of the Wali al-Amr, meaning the idea that if you are the lord of the land, you have absolute control. As even some people go as far as even if you allow people or you force people not to pray, you still have to obey the ruler, and any sort of resistance against the ruler is absolutely haram. That sort of Sufi quietist approach is another form of Islamism, because it's a politicization of Islam, but a very quietist one. Is the polar opposite of the sort of Muslim Brotherhood Islamism. And I think for most people who just go for a week to Dubai to have fun on the beach, they will not see that. They will not be exposed to it. But Sufism has been, so Sufism is obviously the leading branch of Islam now in the UAE, but it's something they've also, again, exported as, under the umbrella of countering violent extremism, of saying there's another form of Islam out there for Muslims in the Western world to embrace, where they say, take the political out of it. If you can use Islam to, talk about, poetry, you can look at architecture, but don't use it for social politics, because that's when it's dangerous. And that's kind of where they draw the line. So as long as you're a Muslim in Dubai and you don't talk about social issues or political issues, you're fine. Once you go off and become political, even on a post on social media, you could get fined or you could be arrested. And that happens to all kinds of Brits, Muslim and non-Muslim. So it's a very fine line, and you wouldn't realize that if you were there for a week. I think once you live there, and I have a lot of friends who moved there and moved back, it becomes very suffocating, because you constantly have to watch what you say, who you engage, and so on. Because it is, I would say, probably the most authoritarian country in the Middle East, probably similar to Iran.
I mean, what you described of the UAE is actually quite, on one level, a very interesting development, because, of course, we're used to governments in the Middle East really acting day by day and not really thinking strategically. But here we've got a state that is very much thinking strategically and thinking ahead and developing not just hard power, these sub-state actors that you talk about, which we will discuss when we look at Sudan and Libya, but also a lot of soft power across the world. I mean, on one level, there is an impressive quality we can attach to the UAE. I mean, is that am I being fair there when describing the UAE?
I think they're a fascinating case study.
Yeah.
I think they're a role model in many ways for other countries in the region, certainly in the Gulf.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with their agenda or not. I think what is impressive is that they have a complete synchronization of all levers of power and influence. So it's not just soft and hard. I mean, they're using the military, they're using societal power, ideology and religion, they're using economic power. All of it is aligned towards driving and securing national interests for the UAE. That's more you can say, more than you can say about any other Arab country, I would say, at least at the moment. And obviously they do have a lot of wealth, but the power and influence that they have is not just their wealth. It's also the careful orchestration. And obviously also, very top-heavy leadership. Anybody who falls out of line in the UAE and Abu Dhabi is gone.
Yeah.
That is not the case even in a country like Saudi Arabia, where there are still some heterarchical structures rather than just hierarchical structures.
Right. So I'm going to temper what I've said there with, of course, it's malign activities in the region. So Sudan comes to mind, and you talk about Sudan in your most recent Middle East Eye article. General Hemedti has been waging a civil war in Sudan, and it's horrid and horrific, and we've seen massacres on a grand scale across Sudan for the last 2 years, and there's famine in some parts of Sudan, and it's unrelenting. Can you just sort of paint a picture of the UAE's relationship with this particular general and the activities of the UAE in Sudan?
Back to how strategic the UAE are. So they built relationships and networks with individuals and outlets very much ahead of time, before they might necessarily become useful. And some of them will never become useful. Right. But the relationship with Hemedti's family goes back to the early 2010s, so way before this war in Sudan starts. Yeah. At the time, obviously, he was already an infamous warlord in Darfur. He was involved in the genocide there in the 2000s, but also a wealthy man who controlled territory where you had where you had gold mines. So he became a businessman with his own militia, but he was influential, and an influential man who needed an outlet to launder his money, to launder gold. And the UAE kind of offered their jurisdiction to him, and saying, if you want to put your money in our banks or you want to invest, you're happy to do so. That was a very strategic move that became extremely handy after Bashir, the old president, 4 decades president of Sudan, left office and was overthrown. And then once the civil war starts in Sudan, they suddenly have someone there that they have a long-standing relationship with. Right. Not just this is someone who's dependent on the UAE. So that goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, the idea that the Emiratis are good at weaponizing interdependence. So they're offering relationships, access to the jurisdiction of the UAE, whether it's through commodity trade or financial services or logistics, any sort of supply chain, or even PR support. You can get it in the UAE. They're offering it. And over time, individuals develop a dependency on that hub, the UAE, that develop a dependency on these sort of services and that jurisdiction. And that's a dependency the UAE can use. It looks like interdependent, like, let me, you help me, I help you sort of thing. But over time, it becomes a codependence where the UAE can say, look, if you want to continuously bank in this country, if you want to do X, Y, and Z, we need something from you now. And Hemedti was willing to give it. So the Emiratis got involved in 2015 in Yemen. They needed a fighting force on the ground to, after they suffered quite significant losses in Yemen. And the RSF, which is the militia that is run by Hemedti in Sudan, was offering to fight as sort of a proxy or mercenary force for the UAE and also for the Saudis. And Hemedti was the guy they could call, they could rely upon. So there's this long-standing relationship. And so Hemedti fights in Yemen. RSF troops do. They make money. They bring that money back into Sudan. They bring the weapons back into Sudan. And so once the revolution starts in Sudan, they already have a curated, long-standing and trusted relationship with one of the key protagonists that they can use and push in the back. So not only does this guy now have, he's a billionaire, and the Hemedti family, they're billionaires. They have their own money, much of it laundered through, a gold trade through UAE. The UAE have emerged for the last 15 years or 10 years as the leading hub for commodity trade, especially gold trade. Yeah. So if you have gold and you want to bring it to market, the UAE offer you the services and the infrastructure to do so. They have a banking sector which is leading in the region. If you want to put your money in and you want to convert it into crypto, you can do that in the UAE. If you then want to get access and buy arms, you can do that in the UAE. If you want to have a private jet or even more a private cargo plane that drives and flies these weapons into anywhere in Africa, the UAE have companies that offer that. So you have an infrastructure there. If you wanted to run a war, the UAE has all of it at hand, and you don't need to rely on the state to do so. These are all semi or private entities. And when I say semi, some of them are based in entities that are owned by the royal family. So it's always a blurry line between state and public. State and private. But on paper, they are private commercial entities who can help you do this stuff. And this is where, Wagner Group, for example, the infamous Russian mercenary force, has used the UAE, relied on the UAE since 2019 to build their bridgehead in Libya, in Northern Africa. And all their Africa operations wouldn't have been possible. They wouldn't be able to roll out that network if it hadn't been for the UAE as a jurisdiction offering them all the services to keep this network of mercenaries and mercenary companies alive. So that makes the Emirates extremely powerful.
Why is it that there isn't any scrutiny or very much scrutiny on the UAE as a jurisdiction for these very unsavory activities? In fact, I remember maybe a few months back, there was a UN report which exonerated the UAE and suggested that there is no relationship between the UAE and Hemedti in Sudan. What's going on there?
I haven't seen that report. But so the overwhelming evidence, any sort of UN Council of Experts, EU experts, independent researchers, academics, are all pointing the finger. I mean, there's journalists, it starts even with journalistic investigations, investigative journalists who've really unpacked how weapons end up in the hands of the RSF, how they're being smuggled from Abu Dhabi or from the UAE via Chad, via Uganda, into Darfur and other parts of Sudan. So that's all very well documented. I think there is no one who's doubting that. There's no one in government here in the UK that is doubting that. And I think part of the relationship, or the problematic relationship that the UK has with the UAE at the moment, is also due to the fact that the UK has called them out for what they've been doing. But the Emiratis are very good at shaping perception. Again, it goes back to networks, right? They spent a lot on PR. They have a network of PR companies, network of people that, if they don't necessarily buy them to speak or push their narratives, at least they pay them to stay silent. Right. Experts who will say, oh, that's all not that bad, what we see in the UAE, or saying this is all coincidental. And another beautiful game that the UAE are playing is, since they're a country of 7 Emirates, they're using one jurisdiction like Dubai or Ajman or Sharjah, and playing them off against Abu Dhabi. So Abu Dhabi is saying, oh yeah, a lot of the smuggling is happening through Ajman in gold smuggle, or it's going through Sharjah, or going through Dubai. We don't know anything about it, but we'll clamp down on it. We in Abu Dhabi don't know anything about it, which they obviously do. But they can basically say, you know, it's a bit of that divide and rule element where they're saying, you know, the federal government doesn't support this, but yes, there are entities in other jurisdiction in the UAE where that are involved in this sort of trade, and that gives them plausible deniability. And so we've seen that game being played as well. But there is plausible deniability because going back to the point I made earlier, these are private networks or semi-private networks. And even if you can point the finger and you have a relationship between someone like Tahnoun bin Zayed and his network of companies, and the relationship of these companies with those companies such as Wagner or others like Hemedti companies, even if you can establish that relationship, it's still a very, very indirect relationship. There are layers upon layers upon layers in this network. And to make a case of saying actually there's a direct relationship, there is never a direct relationship. And I think that's the beauty of network-centric statecraft. There is this layer of plausible deniability.
The Sudanese government recently lodged a case at the ICJ or suggesting that the UAE should be held accountable for supporting Hemedti and this counter-revolutionary force. Very recently, a judgment has come back that the ICJ has no jurisdiction over the UAE's activities. And of course, the UAE government has made a lot of hay out of that and suggested that it's, you know, it exonerates them and you know, the accusations have been you know, incorrect. I mean, what happened there? And explain that ICJ judgment to us.
The judgment so far is it's clearly says in the judgment itself, none of it has to do with the evidence provided,
right?
And nothing has to do with the complicity of. They're not made a judgment on the complicity of the UAE in supporting the RSF. It was a judgment based purely on this, I think, Article 9, which says that the ICJ has no jurisdiction in this case. But it doesn't exonerate the UAE's from the responsibility that they have. And again, that's what it says in the judgment. There is all of the parties involved in the conflict have a responsibility to make sure that genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity do not occur. So the evidence that's been provided showing what the UAE are doing and how they do it, it's overwhelming. I don't think there's anyone who's doubting it.
Right.
Not in the US, not in the UK, not in other European capitals. And they've been calling out the Emiratis for it. What is extraordinary, though, is that the UAE sustained that pressure. And I think that's also a very important point, going back to what you asked earlier about, you know, most of them are client states. The UAE is not acting like a client state. You call out a client state, like the US calling out their client state, stop it. You would expect your client state to fall in line. Yeah. But that no longer occurs. The UAE have made themselves indispensable and so relevant in this part of the world, in East Africa, that the US, the UK, and other European countries can't do without them anymore. They've injected themselves into the debate, in not just the debate, but activity in Somalia, in Yemen, in Egypt, in Libya, and also in Chad and other areas, that if you wanted to do and settle any of these conflicts, you have to speak to the UAE. So you can't antagonize them. And here is a country that is willing to, play a zero-sum game of saying, you want something from me, then you have to be quiet about this. And then obviously there is the massive investments. We see that with the Trump administration. The UAE they promise to inject hundreds of billions of dollars in the US economy, potentially billions into the UK economy. And, you know, at a time when economies are not doing very well, governments in the US or also here in the UK can't afford not to, go into bet with the UAE. So these things are being played very strategically in a way that we in the West are not comfortable with, or that we are not used to. Because again, I think too many people look at the Gulf states as client states, which they are not. They have agency, they have autonomy, strategic autonomy, and they're willing to use it. And the UAE, first, more than anyone else, are willing to use it coercively if they have to.
Can we turn to Libya? Because, of course, there's a conflict that has been raging for some time in Libya after the successful rebellion against Colonel Gaddafi. And the UAE, and you intimated this previously, have been supporting another general, Khalifa Haftar, in his quest to undermine the government, the official government, the UN-recognized government in Tripoli. It seems like there's a parallel there really with what's happening in Sudan. You know, a general who has been undermining that central government. Like, explain the dynamics of what's happening in Libya to us, please.
Again, Libya precedes activities in Sudan.
Yeah.
And so we start off talking 2013 Egypt. It then moves a year later, May, June 2014, into their support for Haftar, who was this kind of degenerate former Gaddafi officer, who then offers himself and has an agenda of saying, I want to create a strong state based on a strong security sector. Again, a sort of military dictatorship. And he suggests to the UAE that he can take the country, which he obviously couldn't, failed multiple times.
Yes.
But the Emiratis still back him. They're still backing him today. And for more than a decade now, they have built a very, very strong relationship. And by creating a relationship in parallel to the existing relationship with the UN-backed government, they've created a sort of sub-state actor, or a quasi-state actor, which is the Libyan National Army, LNA, run by, again, around a patrimonial network run by the Haftar families, not just Haftar himself. He's an aging man. I mean, his sons are equally important. All of them bank through the UAE, so their private wealth is in the UAE, so they're dependent on the UAE. But they can also draw on UAE relationships, whether it's the relationship with Russia, so the Emiratis offered the Wagner relationship to them. They kind of paid for Wagner to emerge in Libya in 2019 and in backing Haftar. Very, very powerful relationship. They have provided, they provided military aid to them, arms. In 2020, during the height of the COVID pandemic, when we're all focusing on what's going on with COVID and lockdowns, the Emiratis were flying dozens and dozens of plane loads of arms into eastern Libya. And that is important because that became sort of the arsenal of military arsenal from which all of what I call the axis of secessionists are still drawing from today. So the UAE dumped these weapons in Libya and then have empowered their own proxy, their own surrogate Haftar, who then later on helps out Hemedti in Sudan, who is, flying arms through to Chad and from Chad going into Sudan. And so what emerges is this carousel, and that's what I wrote about in this article, which is kind of a network of networks. And it starts in Libya, because here you have this non-state actor who can't really capture Tripoli, the capital of Libya, who yet is not, though being defeated, is not disappearing. He still holds quite a lot of power and control in eastern Libya, and becomes a quasi-state actor. And that model, and that's an interesting one, and you ask yourself, why are they replicating that model? Because they replicated that in Yemen, and after 2015, when they backed the Southern movement and then built the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, on top of that, which same model. They realized they can't take the country. They don't want to take all of Yemen because they can't fight the Houthis. So they just take whatever is the kind of the juiciest bit of it, which is the areas along the coast, because again, that's where the Emiratis can build their ports, Abu Dhabi ports and DP World, they can put their ports. So by focusing on that only, they're kind of creating, again, another secessionist group next to the UN-backed government that the Saudis support. And that exists in parallel still today to the government in Sana'a. Now, we're going then 2019 into Sudan. And obviously, since 2023, they're really actively pushing the RSF vis-a-vis the SAF in Sudan. Again, another secessionist actor against the UN-backed government. Same model. So it starts in Libya, goes to Yemen, and then goes to Sudan. And then over the last couple of years, we see the same model being played by the Emiratis also in Somalia, where they're backing the sort of federal states in Puntland, Somaliland, and also in Jubaland, which are entities, states of the Federation of Somalia, and backing their quest for independence. So also secessionist movements. Same model. They build up a militia group, a violent non-state actor. They provide material support and training and arms. And then on top of that, they kind of lend their own sort of political diplomatic clout to these non-state actors, giving them legitimacy. And what starts in Libya has become now a model that the UAE have applied across Eastern Africa. And it seems to work. They haven't won, but if you ask yourselves why they're doing it, I think, my conclusion is obviously they want access. They're also saying it's better to have full control of a small enclave than shared control over an entire country. So having, full control over the juicy bits of Yemen is better than trying to compete for influence across Yemen. Same in Sudan. Having influence over the RSF territory is better than competing for all of Sudan. In Libya, the same thing. You can't get all of Libya, but at least you have full control over a very juicy, very rich part of Libya. And so that is kind of the policy, the strategy that they're driving. And since they're not being contested and nobody's competing with them really, they are still the most potent player among many in all of these countries. They're always the primus inter pares, if not the most influential power. And imagine going back to a country of a million citizens, been elevated to what I would say is middle power status because of that.
It's really extraordinary the picture you paint here. It's very evocative. I mean, this sounds very Machiavellian to its extreme, and countries like Libya for a long period. I know it's somewhat changed now, but for a long period was a failed state. You know, it became a vacuum for criminality and for smuggling and for very nefarious activities. From a UAE perspective, they have no qualms with the bloodshed, the trail of devastation that they established within these countries. I take it that's not a problem for them.
No, and these are means to an end. I mean, the argument the Emiratis would have there is you need to break some eggs to make an omelette. So these are unfortunately means to an end in Libya and Sudan, in Yemen. I mean, Yemen, the stuff that they've done. I mean, they've hired mercenary bands to hunt down, terrorists, which are just civil societal actors who are very loosely affiliated, sometimes with the Muslim Brotherhood or opposition figures, and they just hunt them down and kill them. Wow. And it's all paid for by the UAE. I mean, the BBC did a very good documentary on that.
Wow. Okay. Syria. I've read, and again, I haven't followed since the surprise revolution. We've started to follow Syria once again, but once upon a time, the UAE opted for stability in Syria. Do you feel that the advent of this new government, the HES-led government led by Ahmed al-Sharaa, in a way has been an affront to UAE's policy in Syria? Is it an indication that there are limits to the success of this strategy?
Syria taken on its own is certainly a defeat. It's probably a massive strategic setback for the UAE, also for that overall policy of creating and installing, returning to authoritarian stability. This idea of establishing security sector-based dictatorships, and then not only that, having an Islamist of jihadist nature actually becoming the president. That certainly is a setback. But they've shown the pragmatism in this of hosting al-Sharaa, even being a mediator now between al-Sharaa and Israel. They've been pragmatic in this, but it's also because they realized there's nothing to rescue anymore. I mean, they've been defeated. Qataris and the Saudis are certainly in the driver's seat. But it doesn't, the same kind of happened in Libya in 2019, where they backed the LNA's quest to take over Tripoli and they failed. But it hasn't led to the defeat of the LNA. Same in Sudan. I mean, there's been a couple of setbacks for the RSF, but these are operational setbacks, not strategic ones. I think Syria is a strategic setback for them, but they never invested as much into Syria as they have invested into all these other African countries that I mentioned earlier, or plus Yemen.
So far, we haven't spoken about the relationship, the very strong relationship between the UAE and Israel. I mean, the UAE is the most fervent advocate of the Abraham Accords, and it just seems to me that when it comes to Gaza and the horrific situation in Gaza, the UAE has really been firmly on the side of Israel in this conflict, in inverted commas. Can you explain that relationship? What is the nature of that relationship between Israel and the UAE?
So if you go back to everything I said earlier in terms of their strategic mindset, strategic culture in Abu Dhabi, it very much aligns with Israel's strategic mindset. Right? Israel is extremely hard power heavy in the way they engage. The Israelis have a deep-seated fear of civil society in the Arab world. They have a fear of the Arab world. They framed the Arab Spring as the Arab winter from the beginning. They said this is a major setback because they know the vast majority of Arabs and Muslims will not tolerate the sort of atrocities that are being committed by Israel against the Palestinians for decades. And so having dictators in power that the Americans can deal with or that they can deal with, having one point of contact is always better than having to deal with a civil societal group or a democratically elected entity. They fear Islamism. I studied in Israel, and so I can tell you that the way that they frame the Muslim Brotherhood, the way that they frame political Islam, Islamism, the Arab street, and so on, is very much the same way that the Emiratis have framed it. Yeah. So there is an ideological alignment. There is an ideological alignment in terms of the order that the Israelis would like to see. They would like to see an authoritarian stability. They believe in authoritarian stability. Right. Arab dictatorships running the region. The UAE would like to see the same sort of regional order. Right. So that's it. We always talk about this being a pragmatic relationship with the UAE, and the UAE used this primarily to get access to Republicans and people in the far right in Washington. It's their out of jail card, going back to all the bad things that the Emiratis are involved in. One reason they've never been really called out properly by a lot of congressmen and women in America is because they're on the side of Israel. And many times when I have conversations with staffers or people in Washington over the issue of the UAE, one of the things that always comes back is like, yeah, it's not great what they're doing, but they're the ones who normalized with Israel. So it goes a long way. It's an out of jail card. But beyond that, it's not just a pragmatic alignment. It's one that is ideological. The fear of any sort of resistance, fear of obviously Hamas being kind of the worst nightmare sort of entity. I'm not endorsing them at all, but just having to for them, what goes on in Gaza is more about the problem here is Hamas. The problem is in Israel, and that's ideological.
Right. Finally, I mean, this has been a fascinating conversation. And I think a lot of my viewers would be very, very perturbed by just the sort of the breadth of the tentacles of the UAE and what it's been doing since the advent of the Arab Spring. How does one resist this? I mean, UAE has diplomatic power, it has soft power, it uses hard power, economic might. It's able to change narratives. Here in the West, it does a lot to curate a particular image of itself, and it's been pretty successful, I think, in doing so. It's become a hub for sports and cultural activities across the world. How does one resist this very malign statecraft that the UAE has curated?
Look, it's the only reason the UAE have been so successful over the last 10 years since the Arab Spring is because they've operated more or less in a vacuum, where the West is disengaged from Africa and the Middle East. And also where the partners or the sort of competitors around, like Saudi or Qatar, have been quiet because they've been focused inward or whatnot. Yeah. I think the greatest strategic mistake the UAE have made was in 2017 when they tried to ostracize the Qataris from the GCC. Right. I think that was a strategic mistake because the Qataris, who were very disorganized, quiet, never really spoke about what they're doing and why they're doing it, never had any real networks in the West, didn't have any sort of support in the West, suddenly went into a resistance mode where they, started to invest into PR, where they're trying to attack the Emiratis, where they use their networks, not just Al Jazeera, but, all of it to kind of expose what the Emiratis were up to. And that kind of created, suddenly the Emiratis were no longer operating in a vacuum, because when it came to Libya, the Qataris opposed it. When it came to Syria, the Qataris opposed it. When it comes to Palestine, countries opposed it. So suddenly the Emiratis had to fight. They had to actively compete. Saudi as well. I mean, Saudi when MBS came into power in 2015, 2016, 17, 18, he was under the wings of MBZ. They've since fallen out. There's now competition over economy. The Saudis realize if they want to grow, they need to get some of the FDI, some of the investments from the UAE and divert it to Saudi. So there is competition now between Saudi and the UAE, even over Yemen, where the Saudis are no longer happy with what the UAE are doing. There's competition between Saudi and UAE over Sudan, where the Saudis are backing the UN-backed government. So suddenly the UAE over the last couple of years have found themselves on the other side of a lot of that competition. And as all of the Gulf states, especially Qatar, Saudi, UAE, are competing in that space and have all their own diplomatic cloud, suddenly the UAE's narrative becomes ever more problematic in terms of selling. There's another problem. The UAE's narrative has been, like the Israeli one, extremely coercive. It's about compelling people to say something, coercing people to say something. It's not an organic, consensual
winning
narrative.
Hearts and minds.
Yeah. They have failed to win hearts and minds in the Arab world, and I think Gaza has really exposed this. I think the Arab Accords are done in a way that the Saudis no longer want to touch it. I don't think the Saudis would want to normalize with Israel in the given context. And I think that in this kind of context, I think the Emiratis have failed to be a consensual actor. And that is something that I think is now becoming ever more overt and problematic as they move forward.
Actually, one final question. I mean, do we see within the Emirates, do we see any sizable disapproval from its publics? I know it's very hard to gauge, and public opinion is, of course, across the Arab world is a very, very difficult thing to assess. But Saudi Arabia, we do see levels of public disapproval with some of the activities of MBS. Is there any like-minded activity in UAE?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the UAE is a black box in many ways. It's very difficult. All the evidence you ever have is anecdotal.
Really?
But because they are the most coercive and most invasive police state in this part of the world, because they know how to use, Israeli technology, Pegasus, and all these kind of invasive hacking devices that they have. If you land with your phone in Dubai, your data, your phone is owned by and the Emiratis.
Really?
So that is, that is something that is a big deterrent for people to speak out. And obviously, since the Arab Spring, they've really clamped down on civil society and on freedom of speech. Yeah. So it's very difficult to really speak out. And when UAE citizens speak out, they usually do it in London, and even then they're very careful because they don't know who's watching and who's listening to their devices. Right. But there is certainly resistance, and we've seen it over the last couple of years. Especially there's a north-south divide in the UAE, where the northern Emirates are far less well off than, let's say, Dubai and Abu Dhabi, where they most of the soldiers who fight in Yemen are from the northern Emirates. We've seen them not feeling that they're part of that Emirati project, and they're disproportionately, gaining from what the UAE are doing. And also people in Dubai are not happy with Abu Dhabi taking over all the ministries and dictating terms of policy and statecraft. Yeah. So there are rifts in that society, but they're kind of kept together for the moment. But very difficult, as I said, it's very anecdotal because there's no such thing as public opinion and no ways of measuring in the UAE.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andreas Krieg. I mean, it's been fascinating, very disturbing as well, if you can imagine. But I would imagine you're not going to be lounging on a beach anytime soon in Dubai.
Definitely not, no.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkinmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.